Mark used to be a ranger in the ancient forest near Golden, located in Canada. This forest is considered to be one of the oldest on our planet. Among the locals, there are many legends associated with this place. It's not uncommon to hear about how a group of explorers stumbled upon unknown creatures and strange phenomena in this forest. Elderly people who have spent their entire lives in Golden sit in the bar in the evenings and tell incredible stories that happened to them in this forest. Old rangers who know this forest like the back of their hand are very popular. In the evenings, they gather in bars and talk about all the peculiarities they encountered in these woods. No one takes their stories seriously. Mostly people just enjoy listening to the tales of these elderly gentlemen who, in addition to their main profession, are also excellent storytellers. Mark never dreamed of becoming a ranger. He always strived for city life and wanted to achieve great success in business. But in one moment, Mark's life changed. After graduating from the economics faculty in Toronto, Mark landed a well-paying job and married a lovely girl named Anne. Everything was great for the young couple, until Anne was diagnosed with cancer. Mark tried his hardest to save his beloved. The treatment was very expensive. Mark had to mortgage his home and take out several loans, but all of this was in vain. After a year and a half, Anne passed away. Mark was shattered by grief. His whole world crumbled. He couldn't imagine how he would live on and what to do. Mark had lived in a motel for a long time and hadn't even left his room. He didn't share his grief with anyone, as it was too painful to talk about. One night, Mark woke up in the middle of the night and felt an irresistible urge to take a walk in the forest. Some unknown force drew him there. This thought eclipsed his sorrow. Mark quickly packed his things and went to Golden. There, he fell in love with the local scenery and decided to stay and connect his life with nature. That's how he became a gamekeeper in the local forests. He and a group of gamekeepers would venture into small camps in jeeps. These camps were usually located near the main parks and hunting grounds. Mark was the youngest in his group, which consisted of 12 people. The oldest and most experienced of the gamekeepers was named Franz. Franz was the leader of the camp and always assigned tasks to the other gamekeepers. Among other things, he taught the young people everything they needed to know about the local forests. These places, which besides the scary stories told to children, concealed many real dangers. In these woods covered with majestic ancient spruces, one could often encounter dangerous wild animals, including a pack of wolves, wild boars, and even bears. At first, Franz took the young gamekeepers with him and personally taught them everything. It was already mid-spring when Mark received his latest assignment from Franz to monitor one of the forest areas located beyond the steep cliffs. "Son, go to the western slope and check for any poachers or other scoundrels who might roaming in search of prey," the old man said, placing his hand on Mark's right shoulder. Franz was like a father to them, and all the local gamekeepers respected him greatly. He looked very much like ancient Greek philosophers. He wore a long gray beard. Franz loved to philosophize and talk about the meaning of life. He even used to be called Socrates, but since then, many gamekeepers have changed, and young scouts no longer called him that out of respect. Mark gathered supplies and headed to the designated area. John, one of the jeep drivers, dropped Mark off at the point where the road ended, and Mark had to walk from there. "Friend, be careful. They say there are many dangers in this part of the forest. If something happens, signal immediately," the young man said, sounding alarmed. "Don't believe everything you hear," Mark replied with a smile and disappeared into the forest thicket. John watched the young gamekeeper go. The sight of the forest scared him. The silence here froze his soul. Sometimes he thought he heard voices and strange sounds. John quickly got into the car and drove away. Mark walked through the forest and admired the beauty of these places. From the first days of his work as a gamekeeper, he noticed how his soul gradually began to find peace. Before, he used to dream of city life, thinking that it was full of bustling activity. But the big city didn't give him anything except tiredness, sorrow, and disappointment. Mark was amazed at how his perception of life had changed. If he were brought back to the city now, he would feel an overwhelming pain and longing. Here in the depths of the forest, he felt like he could finally experience happiness, and most importantly, peace. Mark had a radio with him, on which the rangers always communicated. Sometimes he would turn off his radio for a few minutes to enjoy the silence. On the way to his destination, Mark took a short break, had some bacon and eggs, and continued on his way. The forest was alive with its own life. There was no trail in this part of the ancient forest, so Mark had to rely on his compass. Suddenly, Franz's voice came through the radio. In the western region, the guys stumbled upon a mother bear. All rangers in this region, be careful. The guys passed by the bear without touching her. If you see bear cubs, leave immediately, as I taught you. After this warning, Mark turned off his radio. He walked through the forest and enjoyed the sounds of nature. He often thought about how much Anne would have enjoyed it here. He let his imagination run wild, imagining them walking through the woods. Mark pictured Anne's laughter and her smile. Suddenly, Mark's daydreaming was interrupted by a faint woman's voice coming from the thick forest. "Somebody help me, please," cried the woman through sobs. Those words interrupted Mark's thoughts, and he immediately responded. "How did you end up here? What happened to you? Are you hurt?" Mark knew that asking a woman where she was located in the forest was pointless. The sounds in the forest can be deceiving, and it's difficult to determine where the voice is coming from. So, the young gamekeeper wanted to make sure that the woman's life was not in danger. "Thank God. I'm so glad someone is here," the woman replied through tears. "Are you hurt?" Mark asked again. "No, but it's hard for me to breathe," the unfortunate woman replied in a quieter and calmer voice. Mark said, "Don't move. I'll find you. Describe the place where you are. What do you see in front of you?" "I can't move. I'm tightly tied up with ropes. There are only trees, fog, and candles around me," the woman said with hope in her voice. Mark didn't see any fog nearby, so he thought that the girl might be on top of a hill. Sometimes clouds cover the hills where trees grow, and the cloud settles in such a way that it cannot be distinguished from fog. The gamekeeper first took out his radio, turned it on, and wanted to report to Franz's rescue group that he had found a woman in the woods. However, he could only hear interference and some unintelligible voices on the other side. It was strange, but Mark thought he heard Anne's voice on the radio. However, she seemed to be speaking in some unknown language. Mark quickly dismissed it as radio interference and forgot about it. He tried to contact the other gamekeeper a couple more times, but he had no luck. Mark was getting closer to the top of the hill. He had already started to sweat and had used up most of his strength. Meanwhile, it was getting dark. The forest was becoming shrouded in darkness, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish anything. He was going uphill, which was his only landmark. Mark hoped to find the girl, give her first aid if she needed it, and stay overnight by setting up a camp. He had no other choice, as walking through the forest at night was very dangerous. One could fall into a ravine, stumble upon traps, or run into a pack of wolves. You couldn't move at night, especially alone. Mark made his way through the dense forest, and as he climbed up the slope, he began to feel very tired. He had been wandering around the forest all day, and his strength was beginning to wane. The woman's cries were getting closer and closer. The hunter decided to contact his comrades once again. As soon as he turned on the radio, he heard a hoarse woman's voice whispering something unintelligible. Mark couldn't make out the words. It seemed to him that the woman was whispering something in Latin. Her words were occasionally interrupted, and in the pauses she breathed heavily, almost like an animal. It definitely wasn't just interference on the radio. Mark was scared listening to those sounds. He changed frequencies, trying to find anyone, but all he could hear was that creepy, raspy whisper. Mark realized he was getting scared. He quickly turned off the radio and headed for the summit. He wanted to find a woman as soon as possible, to be near a living soul. Along the way, every rustle of leaves and creak of trees made Mark look around. He heard the same raspy female whisper on the radio again. Mark took out his radio and turned it off, but the voice continued whispering. Mark was horrified and took out the batteries. The voice stopped for a moment. Suddenly, the gamekeeper heard a whisper behind him again. But this time the voice sounded so close, as if someone whispered directly into his ear. Mark even felt a slight breeze. Mark shouted, "Damn it," and ran with all his might. He himself didn't know how long he ran. Suddenly he saw dense fog among the thick trees. "Are you still here? Don't leave me, please," the bound woman cried out in despair. "Yes, I'm close. Hold on," Mark replied, looking around in fear. Mark walked through the fog. The fog was so thick that he couldn't see anything beyond a certain point. Tree trunks only appeared before him when he approached them closely. He was scared every time he saw a tall silhouette through the fog. He shuddered, looked ahead for a while, trying to see something, and only then moved forward. He couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling that someone was following him. Mark kept turning around. The cold was replaced by heat, and sweat began pouring down his forehead. He didn't have the strength to turn around, so he started running again. He repeatedly bumped into trees that were invisible due to the fog and fell to the ground. But he got up and kept running. Mark didn't want to look back. He had many thoughts racing through his head. Sometimes he felt like he was dead or asleep, but everything was too real. At some point, Mark stumbled over a fallen tree and hit his head hard on something. At that moment, he lost consciousness. When he came to, the gamekeeper looked at his watch. It was already midnight. He had been unconscious for several hours. The fog had cleared up a bit, and Mark saw the same woman who had asked him for help. The woman was tied about 5 meters high to the trunk of a large spruce. She had light red hair and incredibly attractive facial features. Her whole body was covered only by a nightgown, which accentuated the graceful curves of her body. Directly under the tree, wooden boards were piled up in the shape of a pyramid. Extinguished candles were placed around the entire area. Mark called out to her a couple of times, and when the girl didn't respond, he decided to approach her himself. The girl was unconscious. Her thin, pale hands and legs were tightly bound with rope. The gamekeeper stood at the foot of the tree and thought about how to get the poor girl off the tree. With the help of a hook, the gamekeeper climbed the tree and started trying to bring the girl back to consciousness. As soon as the woman woke up, she started screaming and waving her arms in fear. Mark said, "Please calm down. I'm trying to help you. I'm the one who spoke with you yesterday evening." The girl furrowed her brow and thought for a moment, then asked skeptically, "Why did it take you so long to get here?" Mark wanted to tell her about what had happened to him on the way, but he decided it wouldn't help her right now. "I got lost in the fog. Now I'm going to untie you. You need to hold on to me tightly or else you'll fall." The exhausted girl did as the hunter instructed. Mark cut the ropes and freed the girl. He slowly and carefully descended with her. The girl was lightly dressed, and the night was cold. Mark took out his spare uniform from his backpack and put it on the girl. "How did you end up here?" Mark asked. The girl thought for a long time before answering him, her voice trembling as she began her story. "My name is Milena. The day before yesterday evening, when I was returning from work, some people in masks kidnapped me. They put a bag over my head and forced me into a car. For some reason, all of these people were speaking in an unfamiliar language to me. I didn't understand anything they were saying. They didn't talk to me, only to each other. Then they took me to some place. My face was covered with a bag, but I could feel that we were going down somewhere. And I was right. They put me in a basement where candles were everywhere. They took off all my clothes and dressed me in that outfit. About once an hour, a man in a mask came down to my basement and read some incomprehensible texts. No one responded to my cries for help. They ignored my screams, tears, and pleas. After some time, one of them gave me an injection, and then I lost consciousness. I woke up yesterday evening in that place. Hearing Malena's story, Mark was filled with incredible anger towards her kidnappers. "Scumbags," he said. "You must have been kidnapped by some sick occultists. You're lucky to be alive." The girl didn't respond to these words. Mark started to set up camp. He couldn't find his signal fire. It must have fallen somewhere along the way. He lit a fire to warm himself and scare away wild animals. Then he took out his radio and remembered the scary female voice that had been haunting him in the forest. Now that he wasn't alone anymore, he somehow felt braver. It's not as scary, even if your only companion is a helpless girl. The hunter took out a spare battery from his backpack, put it in the radio, and started catching a signal. This time the radio only gave interference. Mark thought that they were probably already looking for him. He had to return to camp or make contact by midnight last night. In such cases, the search team immediately sets out to find you. Mark turned to the girl and noticed her downcast gaze. She was incredibly charming. Her silence made her even more mysterious. Lena unexpectedly spoke up, still gazing at the campfire. "We need to go. It's not safe to walk through the forest at night." "We'll set out at dawn when it's light out," Mark replied. "But by then it will be too late," the girl whispered, staring at Mark with her tender eyes. "They will come back for me, to complete their ritual. If they come back, they'll see the burning fire and won't come near us. And if they do, I have a revolver with me."
"Will you kill them?" Milena asked unexpectedly. "Will you kill them if they attack?"
Mark was stunned. This question caught him off guard. There was something strange in the girl's eyes at that moment. Malena's eyes revealed sorrow and sadness. Mark, not knowing what to say, answered, "Yes, I'll kill them. People like them don't deserve to live." "Then who deserves to live?" Milena asked curiously. At that moment, Mark hesitated. Did he have the right to judge who deserved to live and who didn't? With trembling voice, Mark replied, "Unfortunately, death comes first for good people, and scoundrels often leave to old age." Milena noticed it. "Did you lose someone you loved?" she sympathetically asked Mark, leaning towards him. "Yes," Mark replied. "My wife died from cancer a few months ago. We lived in a big city because that's what I wanted, but she always wanted to be closer to nature." "Please accept my condolences," Milena said, looking embarrassed. Both sat in silence for a minute. Mark was lost in his thoughts and trying to catch any signal on the radio. Looking around, he noticed the tree from which he had taken the girl. Deep scratches were visible on the huge spruce. By the looks of it, a bear must have sharpened its claws on this tree. But the scratches went up to the spot where the girl was hanging. Milena noticed how thoughtfully Mark was looking at the tree. "Anne would have liked it here, I think," the girl said, and stopped, not finishing her sentence. For a moment, Mark thought that Anne would have really liked it here. Then, unexpectedly to himself, he realized that he had not told Milena that his wife's name was Anne. The gamekeeper wasn't sure if he had said his late wife's name or not. While he was thinking, the fire he had lit went out in an instant. The same hoarse female voice that whispered the frightening words could be heard again. Mark was overcome with horror that couldn't be described in words. Turning around in the darkness of the night, he saw a skinny silhouette with long arms and legs standing in the very spot where Milena had been sitting. The creature spoke with that same female voice that had frightened Mark before and drove him to this peak. The stunned gamekeeper reached for his revolver and fired at the unknown creature. But the bullet had no effect. It moved so fast that the eye couldn't keep up with it, and its hair was flowing from side to side. The beast's silhouette was very difficult to distinguish in the darkness. Mark couldn't hit the creature even once. Shots echoed through the forest, and after them, there was a deathly silence. His heart was beating so hard that his chest began to hurt. The smoke from the shots dissipated. The young man's eyes had adapted to the darkness, and he began to make out something. He saw the creature on the very tree from which he had taken the girl. It dug its claws into the tree and sat on the trunk like a spider. Her face was disfigured with long teeth, and her matted hair had turned into gray strands of dirty hair. It was Milena, her true form. Mark couldn't believe what was happening. He couldn't overcome this beast. He was doomed to die. The gamekeeper resigned himself to his fate and closed his eyes, preparing for his inevitable death. The creature continued to whisper and jump from tree to tree with incredible speed and agility. Mark suddenly heard Franz's voice behind him. He said, "Something was here. I saw a fire. Perhaps shots were fired from here." Mark opened his eyes and saw the beast jump down from the tree and run into the woods. Mark shouted. His companions quickly ran up to him and started asking him what happened. Mark's story became one of those tales that gamekeepers exchange in pubs in the evenings. Some believed the story, while others didn't. But since then, Mark never went into the woods alone again.